San Battista Paciere. Chapter 8. Goat Face. Recording by Joy Chan. All the ill deeds that a man commits have some colour of excuse, either contempt which provokes, need which compels, love which blinds, or anger which breaks the neck. But ingratitude is a thing that has no excuse, true or false, upon which it can fix, and it is therefore the worst of vices, since it dries up the fountain of compassion, extinguishes the fire of love, closes the road to benefits, and causes vexation and repentance to spring up in the hearts of the ungrateful, as you will see in the story which I am about to relate. A peasant had 12 daughters, not one of whom was a head taller than the next, for every year their mother presented him with a little girl, so that the poor man, to support his family decently, went early every morning as a day labourer and dug hard the whole day long. With what his labour produced, he just kept his little ones from dying of hunger. He happened one day to be digging at the foot of a mountain, the spy of other mountains, that thrust its head above the clouds to see what they were doing up in the sky, and close to a cavern so deep and dark that the sun was afraid to enter it. Out of this cavern there came a green lizard as big as a crocodile, and the poor man was so terrified that he had not the power to run away, expecting every moment the end of his days from a gulp of that ugly animal. But the lizard, approaching him, said, "Be not afraid, my good man, for I am not come here to do you any harm, but to do you good." When Masaniello, for that was the name of the labourer, heard this, he fell on his knees and said, "Mistress, what's your name? I am wholly in your power. Act then worthily, and have compassion on this poor trunk that has 12 branches to support." "It is on this very account," said the lizard, "that I am disposed to serve you. So bring me tomorrow morning the youngest of your daughters, for I will rear her up like my own child, and love her as my life." At this the poor father was more confounded than a thief when the stolen goods are found on his back. For hearing the lizard ask him for one of his daughters, and that too the tenderest of them, he concluded that the cloak was not without wool on it, and that she wanted the child as a titbit to stay her appetite. Then he said to himself, "If I give her my daughter, I give her my soul. If I refuse her, she will take this body of mine. If I yield her, I am robbed of my heart. If I deny her, she will suck out my blood. If I consent, she takes away part of myself. If I refuse, she takes the whole. What shall I resolve on? What course shall I take? What expedient shall I adopt? Oh, what an ill day's work have I made of it! What a misfortune has rained down from heaven upon me!" While he was speaking thus, the lizard said, "Resolve quickly and do what I tell you, or you will leave only your rags here. For so I will have it, and so it will be." Masaniello, hearing this decree, and having no one to whom he could appeal, returned home quite melancholy, as yellow in the face as if he had jaundice, and his wife, seeing him hanging his head like a sick bird, and his shoulders like one that is wounded, said to him, "What has happened to you, husband? Have you had a quarrel with any one? Is there a warrant out against you? Or is the ass dead?" "Nothing of that sort," said Masaniello, "but a horned lizard has put me into a fright, for she has threatened that if I do not bring her our youngest daughter, she will make me suffer for it. My head is turning like a reel, I know not what fish to take. On one side love constrains me, on the other the burden of my family. I love Renzolla dearly, I love my own life dearly. If I do not give the lizard this portion of my heart, she will take the whole compass of my unfortunate body. So now, dear wife, advise me, or I am ruined." When his wife heard this, she said, "Who knows, husband, but this may be a lizard with 2 tails that will make our fortune? Who knows but this lizard may put an end to all our miseries? How often, when we should have an eagle's sight to discern the good luck that is running to meet us, we have a cloth before our eyes and the cramp in our hands when we should lay hold on it. So go, take her away, for my heart tells me that some good fortune awaits the poor little thing." These words comforted Masaniello, and the next morning, as soon as the sun with the brush of his rays whitewashed the sky, which the shades of night had blackened, he took the little girl by the hand and led her to the cave. Then the lizard came out, and taking the child, gave the father a bag full of crowns, saying, "Go now, be happy, for Renzolla has found both father and mother." Masaniello, overjoyed, thanked the lizard and went home to his wife. There was money enough for portions to all the other daughters when they married, and even then the old folks had sauce remaining for themselves to enable them to swallow with relish the toils of life. Then the lizard made a most beautiful palace for Renzolla, and brought her up in such state and magnificence as would have dazzled the eyes of any queen. She wanted for nothing. Her food was fit for a count, her clothing for a princess. She had 100 maidens to wait upon her, and with such good treatment she grew as sturdy as an oak tree. It happened, as the king was out hunting in those parts, that night overtook him, and as he stood looking round, not knowing where to lay his head, he saw a candle shining in the palace. So he sent one of his servants to ask the owner to give him shelter. When the servant came to the palace, the lizard appeared before him in the shape of a beautiful lady, who, after hearing his message, said that his master should be 1,000 times welcome, and that neither bread nor knife should there be wanting. The king, on hearing this reply, went to the palace and was received like a cavalier. 100 pages went out to meet him, so that it looked like the funeral of a rich man. 100 other pages brought the dishes to the table, 100 others made a brave noise with musical instruments. But above all, Renzolla served the king, and handed him drink with such grace that he drank more love than wine. When he had thus been so royally entertained, he felt he could not live without Renzolla. So, calling the fairy, he asked her for his wife, whereupon the fairy, who wished for nothing but Renzolla's good, not only freely consented, but gave her a dowry of 7 millions of gold. The king, overjoyed at this piece of good fortune, departed with Renzolla, who, ill-mannered and ungrateful for all the fairy had done for her, went off with her husband, without uttering one single word of thanks. Then the fairy, beholding such ingratitude, cursed her, and wished that her face should become like that of a she-goat. And hardly had she uttered the words, when Renzolla's mouth stretched out, with a beard a span long in it, her jaws shrunk, her skin hardened, her cheeks grew hairy, and her plaited tresses turned to pointed horns. When the poor king saw this, he was thunderstruck, not knowing what had happened that so great a beauty should be thus transformed. And with sighs and tears he exclaimed, "Where are the locks that bound me? Where are the eyes that transfixed me? Must I then be the husband of a she-goat? No, no, my heart shall not break for such a goat-face." So saying, as soon as they reached his palace, he put Renzolla into a kitchen, along with a chambermaid, and gave to each of them 10 bundles of flax to spin, commanding them to have the thread ready at the end of a week. The maid, in obedience to the king, set about carding the flax, preparing and putting it on the distaff, twirling her spindle, reeling it, and working away without ceasing, so that on Saturday evening her thread was all done. But Renzolla, thinking she was still the same as in the fairy's house, not having looked at herself in the glass, threw the flax out of the window, saying, "A pretty thing indeed of the king to set me such work to do! If he wants shirts, let him buy them, and not fancy that he picked me up out of the gutter. But let him remember that I brought him home 7 millions of gold, and that I am his wife and not his servant. Methinks, too, that he is somewhat of a donkey to treat me this way." Nevertheless, when Saturday morning came, seeing that the maid had spun all her share of the flax, Renzolla was greatly afraid. So away she went to the palace of the fairy, and told her misfortune. Then the fairy embraced her with great affection, and gave her a bag full of spun thread, to present to the king, and show him what a notable and industrious housewife she was. Renzolla took the bag, and without saying one word of thanks, went to the royal palace. So again the fairy was quite angered at the conduct of the graceless girl. When the king had taken the thread, he gave 2 little dogs, one to Renzolla and one to the maid, telling them to feed and rear them. The maid reared hers on breadcrumbs, and treated it like a child, but Renzolla grumbled, saying, "A pretty thing, truly! As my grandfather used to say, are we living under the Turks? Am I indeed to comb and wait upon dogs?" And she flung the dog out of the window. Some months afterwards the king asked for the dogs, whereat Renzolla, losing heart, ran off again to the fairy, and at the gate stood the old man who was the porter. "Who are you?" said he, "and whom do you want?" Renzolla, hearing herself addressed in this off-hand way, replied, "Don't you know me, you old goat-beard?" "Why do you miscall me?" said the porter. "This is the thief accusing the constable. I a goat-beard, indeed! You are a goat-beard and a half, and you merit it, and worse for your presumption. Wait a while, you impudent woman, I'll enlighten you, and you will see to what your airs and impertinence have brought you." So saying, he ran into his room, and taking a looking-glass, set it before Renzolla, who, when she saw her ugly, hairy visage, was like to have died with terror. Her dismay at seeing her face so altered that she did not know herself cannot be told. Whereupon the old man said to her, "You ought to recollect, Renzolla, that you are a daughter of a peasant, and that it was the fairy that raised you to be a queen. But you, rude, unmannerly, and thankless as you are, having little gratitude for such high favours, have kept her waiting outside your heart, without showing the slightest mark of affection. You have brought the quarrel on yourself. See what a face you have got by it. See to what you are brought by your ingratitude. For through the fairy's spell you have not only changed face, but condition. But if you will do as this white beard advises, go and look for the fairy, throw yourself at her feet, tear your beard, beat your breast, and ask pardon for the ill treatment you have shown her. She is tender-hearted, and she will be moved to pity by your misfortune." Renzolla, who was touched to the quick, and felt that he had hit the nail on the head, followed the old man's advice. Then the fairy embraced and kissed her, and restoring her to her former appearance, she clad her in a robe that was quite heavy with gold, and placing her in a magnificent coach, accompanied with a crowd of servants, she brought her to the king. When the king beheld her so beautiful and splendidly attired, he loved her as his own life, blaming himself for all the misery he had made her endure, but excusing himself on account of that odious goat-face which had been the cause of it. Thus Renzolla lived happy, loving her husband, honouring the fairy, and showing herself grateful to the old man, having learned to her cost that it is always good to be mannerly. End of chapter 8.
This story is relatively straightforward. It's one of the early fairy tales giving the lesson that unless you're polite to fairies, they'll curse you, which is found pretty much throughout Europe. In terms of statistics, we now have the great lizard fairy queen. I need to come up with a better name.
Stories from Pentamerone by Giambattista Passire. Chapter 9. The Enchanted Doe. Recording by Joy Chan. Great is the power of friendship, which makes us willingly bear toils and perils to serve a friend. We value our wealth as a trifle and life as a straw, when we can give them for a friend's sake. Fables teach us this, and history is full of instances of it, and I will give you an example which my grandmother used to relate to me. So open your ears and shut your mouths, and hear what I shall tell you. There was once a certain king of Long Trellis, named Giannone, who, desiring greatly to have children, continually made prayers to the gods that they would grant his wish. And, in order to incline them the more to his petition, he was so charitable to beggars and pilgrims that he shared with them all he possessed. But seeing at last that these things availed him nothing, and that there was no end to putting his hand into his pocket, he bolted fast his door, and shot with a crossbow at all who came near. Now it happened one day that a long-bearded pilgrim was passing that way, and not knowing that the king had turned over a new leaf, or perhaps knowing it and wishing to make him change his mind again, he went to Giannone and begged for shelter in his house. But with a fierce look and a terrible growl, the king said to him, "If you have no other candle than this, you may go to bed in the dark. The kittens have their eyes open, and I am no longer a child." And when the old man asked what was the cause of this change, the king replied, "To further my desire for children, I have spent and lent to all who came and all who went, and have squandered all my treasure. At last, seeing the beard was gone, I stopped shaving and laid aside the razor." "If that be all," replied the pilgrim, "you may set your mind at rest, for I promise that your wish shall forthwith be fulfilled, on pain of losing my ears." "Be it so," said the king. "I pledge my word that I will give you 1/2 of my kingdom." And the man answered, "Listen now to me. If you wish to hit the mark, you have only to get the heart of a sea-dragon, and have it cooked and eaten by the queen, and you will see that what I say will speedily come to pass." "That hardly seems possible," said the king, "but at the worst I lose nothing by the trial, so I must this very moment get the dragon's heart." So he sent 100 fishermen out, and they got ready all kinds of fishing tackle, drag nets, casting nets, seine nets, bow nets, and fishing lines, and they tacked and turned and cruised in all directions until at last they caught a dragon. Then they took out its heart and brought it to the king, who gave it to the queen to cook and eat. And when she had eaten it, there was great rejoicing, for the king's desire was fulfilled, and he became the father of 2 sons, so like the other that nobody but the queen could tell which was which. And the boys grew up together in such love for one another that they could not be parted for a moment. Their attachment was so great that the queen began to be jealous at seeing that the son whom she destined to be heir to his father, and whose name was Fonzo, testified more affection for his brother Canneloro than he did for herself. And she knew not in what way to remove this thorn from her eyes. Now one day Fonzo wished to go a-hunting with his brother, so he had a fire lighted in his chamber, and began to melt lead to make bullets. And being in want of I know not what, he went himself to look for it. Meanwhile the queen came in, and finding no one there but Canneloro, she thought to put him out of the world. So stooping down, she flung the hot bullet mould at his face, which hit him over the brow and made an ugly wound. She was just going to repeat the blow when Fonzo came in. So, pretending that she was only come in to see how he was, she gave him some caresses and went away. Canneloro, pulling his hat down on his forehead, said nothing of his wound to Fonzo, but stood quite quiet, though he was burning with the pain. But as soon as they had done making the bowls, he told his brother that he must leave him. Fonzo, all in amazement at this new resolution, asked him the reason. But he replied, "Inquire no more, my dear Fonzo. Let it suffice that I am obliged to go away and part with you, who are my heart and my soul and the breath of my body. Since it cannot be otherwise, farewell, and keep me in remembrance." Then after embracing one another and shedding many tears, Canneloro went to his own room. He put on a suit of armour and a sword, and armed himself from top to toe. And, having taken a horse out of the stable, he was just putting his foot into the stirrup when Fonzo came weeping and said, "Since you are resolved to abandon me, you should at least leave me some token of your love, to diminish my anguish for your absence." Thereupon Canneloro struck his dagger into the ground, and instantly a fine fountain rose up. Then he said to his twin brother, "This is the best memorial I can leave you. By the flowing of this fountain you will follow the course of my life. If you see it run clear, know that my life is likewise clear and tranquil. If it is turbid, think that I am passing through troubles. And if it is dry, depend on it that the oil of my life is all consumed, and that I have paid the toll which belongs to nature." Then he drove his sword into the ground, and immediately a myrtle tree grew up, when he said, "As long as this myrtle is green, know that I too am green as a leek. If you see it wither, think that my fortunes are not the best in this world, but if it becomes quite dried up, you may mourn for your Canneloro." So saying, after embracing one another again, Canneloro set out on his travels, journeying on and on, with many adventures which it would be too long to recount. He at length arrived at the kingdom of Clear Water, just at the time when they were holding a most splendid tournament, the hand of the king's daughter being promised to the victor. Here Canneloro presented himself, and bore him so bravely that he overthrew all the knights who were come from divers parts to gain a name for themselves. Whereupon he married the Princess Venetia, and a great feast was made. When Canneloro had been there some months in peace and quiet, an unhappy fancy came into his head for going to the chase. He told it to the king, who said to him, "Take care, my son-in-law, do not be deluded. Be wise and keep open your eyes, for in these woods is a most wicked ogre, who changes his form every day, one time appearing like a wolf, at another like a lion, now like a stag, now like an ass, like one thing, and now like another. By 1,000 stratagems he decoys those who are so unfortunate as to meet him into a cave, where he devours them. So, my son, do not put your safety into peril, or you will leave your rags there." Canneloro, who did not know what fear was, paid no heed to the advice of his father-in-law. As soon as the sun, with the broom of his rays, had cleared away the soot of the night, he set out for the chase. And, on his way, he came to a wood where, beneath the awning of the leaves, the shades had assembled to maintain their sway, and to make a conspiracy against the sun. The ogre, seeing him coming, turned himself into a handsome doe, which, as soon as Canneloro perceived, he began to give chase to her. Then the doe doubled and turned, and led him about hither and thither at such a rate, that at last she brought him into the very heart of the wood, where she raised such a tremendous snowstorm that it looked as if the sky was going to fall. Canneloro, finding himself in front of a cave, went into it to seek for shelter, and being benumbed with the cold, he gathered some sticks which he found within it, and pulling his steel from his pocket, he kindled a large fire. As he was standing by the fire to dry his clothes, the doe came to the mouth of the cave and said, "Sir Knight, pray give me leave to warm myself a little while, for I am shivering with the cold." Canneloro, who was of a kindly disposition, said to her, "Draw near and welcome." "I would gladly," replied the doe, "but I am afraid you would kill me." "Fear nothing," answered Canneloro, "trust to my word." "If you wish me to enter," rejoined the doe, "tie up those dogs that they may not hurt me, and tie up your horse that he may not kick me." So Canneloro tied up his dogs and hobbled his horse, and the doe said, "I am now half assured, but unless you bind fast your sword, I dare not come in." Then Canneloro, who wished to become friends with the doe, bound his sword as a countryman does, when he carries it in the city for fear of the constables. As soon as the ogre saw Canneloro defenceless, he retook his own form, and laying hold on him, flung him into a pit at the bottom of the cave, and covered it up with a stone to keep him to eat. But Fonzo, who morning and evening visited the myrtle and the fountain to learn news of the fate of Canneloro, finding the one withered and the other troubled, instantly thought that his brother was undergoing misfortunes. So, to help him, he mounted his horse without asking leave of his father or mother, and arming himself well, and taking 2 enchanted dogs, he went rambling through the world. He roamed and rambled here, there, and everywhere, until at last he came to clear water, which he found all in mourning for the supposed death of Canneloro. And scarcely was he come to the court, when every one, thinking, from the likeness he bore him, that it was Canneloro, hastened to tell Fenicia the good news, who ran leaping down the stairs, and embracing Fonzo cried, "My husband! My heart! Where have you been all this time?" Fonzo immediately perceived that Canneloro had come to this country and had left it again, so he resolved to examine the matter adroitly, to learn from the princess's discourse where his brother might be found. And, hearing her say that he had put himself in great danger by that accursed hunting, especially if the cruel ogre should meet him, he at once concluded that Canneloro must be there. The next morning, as soon as the sun had gone forth to give the gilded frills to the sky, he jumped out of bed, and neither the prayers of Fenicia nor the commands of the king could keep him back, but he would go to the chase. So, mounting his horse, he went with the enchanted dogs to the wood, where the same thing befell him that had befallen Canneloro. And, entering the cave, he saw his brother's arms and dogs and horse fast bound, by which he became assured of the nature of the snare. Then the doe told him in like manner to tie his arms, dogs, and horse, but he instantly set them upon her, and they tore her to pieces. and as he was looking about for some traces of his brother, he heard his voice down in the pit. So, lifting up the stone, he drew out Canneloro, with all the others whom the ogre had buried alive to fatten. Then, embracing each other with great joy, the twin brothers went home, where Fenicia, seeing them so much alike, did not know which to choose for her husband, until Canneloro took off his cap, and she saw the mark of the old wound and recognized him. Fonzo stayed there a month, taking his pleasure, and then wished to return to his own country, and Canneloro wrote by him to his mother, bidding her lay aside her enmity, and come and visit him, and partake of his greatness, which she did. But from that time forward he never would hear of dogs or of hunting, recollecting the saying, "Unhappy is he who corrects himself at his own cost." End of chapter 9.
In interesting news, you can catch sea dragons off the southern coast of Italy. The children that are produced by eating a sea dragon heart presumably have some sort of strong magical nature. One of them is clearly able to create familiar-like objects, a spring of water and a tree that can be used to signal his twin. Strangely, they don't have that sort of psychic connection we see in some folkloristic twins.
Stories from Pentamerone by Giambattista Basile. Chapter 10. Parsley. Recording by Joy Chan. This is one of the stories which that good soul, my uncle's grandmother, whom heaven take to glory, used to tell, and, unless I have put on my spectacles upside down, I fancy it will give you pleasure. There was, once upon a time, a woman named Pascadosia, and one day, when she was standing at her window, she looked into the garden of an ogress. She saw such a fine bed of parsley that she almost fainted away with desire for some. So when the ogress went out, she could not restrain herself any longer, but plucked a handful of it. The ogress came home and was going to cook her pottage, when she found that some one had been stealing the parsley, and said, "Ill luck to me, but I'll catch this long-fingered rogue, and make him repent it. I'll teach him to his cost that every one should eat off his own platter, and not meddle with other folks' cups." The poor woman went out again and again down into the garden, until one morning the ogress met her, and in a furious rage exclaimed, "Have I caught you at last, you thief, you rogue? Prithee, do you pay the rent of the garden that you come in this impudent way and steal my plants? By my faith, I'll make you do penance without sending you to Rome." Poor Pascadosia, in a terrible fright, began to make excuses, saying that neither from gluttony nor the craving of hunger had she been tempted by the devil to commit this fault, but from her fear lest her child should be born with a crop of parsley on its face. "Words are but wind," answered the ogress. "I am not to be caught with such prattle. You have closed the balance sheet of life, unless you promise to give me the child, girl or boy, whichever it may be." The poor woman, in order to escape the peril in which she found herself, swore with one hand upon the other to keep the promise, and so the ogress let her go free. But when the baby came, it was a little girl, so beautiful that she was a joy to look upon, who was named Parsley. The little girl grew from day to day, until, when she was 7 years old, her mother sent her to school. And every time she went along the street and met the ogress, the old woman said to her, "Tell your mother to remember her promise." And she went on repeating this message so often that the poor mother, having no longer patience to listen to the refrain, said one day to Parsley, "If you meet the old woman as usual, and she reminds you of the hateful promise, answer her, take it." When Parsley, who dreamt of no ill, met the ogress again, and heard her repeat the same words, she answered innocently as her mother had told her, whereupon the ogress, seizing her by her hair, carried her off to a wood which the horses of the sun never entered, not having paid the toll to the pastures of those shades. Then she put the poor girl into a tower, which she caused to arise by her art, having neither gate nor ladder, but only a little window through which she ascended and descended, by means of Parsley's hair, which was very long, just as sailors climb up and down the mast of a ship. Now it happened one day, when the ogress had left the tower, that Parsley put her head out of the little window and let loose her tresses in the sun, and the son of a prince passing by saw those two golden banners which invited all souls to enlist under the standard of beauty, and beholding with amazement, in the midst of those gleaming waves, a face that enchanted all hearts, he fell desperately in love with such wonderful beauty, and sending her a memorial of sighs, she decreed to receive him into favour. She told him her troubles, and implored him to rescue her. But a gossip of the ogress, who was for ever prying into things that did not concern her, and poking her nose into every corner, overheard the secret, and told the wicked woman to be on the look-out, for Parsley had been seen talking with a certain youth, and she had her suspicions. The ogress thanked the gossip for the information, and said that she would take good care to stop up the road. As to Parsley, it was, moreover, impossible for her to escape, as she had laid a spell upon her, so that unless she had in her hand the 3 gall-nuts which were in a rafter in the kitchen, it would be labour lost to attempt to get away. Whilst they were thus talking together, Parsley, who stood with her ears wide open, and had some suspicion of the gossip, overheard all that had passed. And when Night had spread out her black garments to keep them from the moth, and the prince had come as they had appointed, she let fall her hair. He seized it with both hands, and cried, "Draw up!" When he was drawn up, she made him first climb onto the rafters and find the gall-nuts, knowing well what effect they would have, as she had been enchanted by the ogress. Then, having made a rope ladder, they both descended to the ground, took to their heels, and ran off towards the city. But the gossip, happening to see them come out, set up a loud halloo, and began to shout and make such a noise that the ogress awoke, and seeing that Parsley had run away, she descended by the same ladder, which was still fastened to the window, and set off after the couple, who, when they saw her coming at their heels faster than a horse let loose, gave themselves up for lost. But Parsley, recollecting the gall-nuts, quickly threw one of the ground, and lo! instantly a Corsican bulldog started up, O mother, such a terrible beast, which, with open jaws and barking loud, flew at the ogress as if to swallow her at a mouthful. But the old woman, who was more cunning and spiteful than ever, put her hand into her pocket, and pulling out a piece of bread, gave it to the dog, which made him hang his tail and allay his fury. Then she turned to run after the fugitives again, but Parsley, seeing her approach, threw the second gall-nut on the ground, and lo! a fierce lion arose, who, lashing the earth with his tail, and shaking his mane, and opening wide his jaws a yard apart, was just preparing to make a slaughter of the ogress, when, turning quickly back, she stripped the skin off an ass which was grazing in the middle of a meadow, and ran at the lion, who, fancying it a real jackass, was so frightened that he bounded away as fast as he could. The ogress, having leapt over this second ditch, turned again to pursue the poor lovers, who, hearing the clatter of her heels, and seeing clouds of dust that rose up to the sky, knew that she was coming again. But the old woman, who was every moment in dread lest the lion should pursue her, had not taken off the ass's skin, and when Parsley now threw down the third gall-nut, there sprang up a wolf, who, without giving the ogress time to play any new trick, gobbled her up just as she was in the shape of a jackass. So Parsley and the prince, now freed from danger, went their way leisurely and quietly to the prince's kingdom, where, with his father's free consent, they were married. Thus, after all these storms of fate, they experienced the truth that 1 hour in port, the sailor, freed from fears, forgets the tempests of 100 years. End chapter 10.
So that story is now more familiarly known as Rapunzel. Rapunzel is the Brothers Grimm version. We don't actually know what a Rapunzel is. We assume it's a type of cress in this story. Parsley, of course. The gall nuts that she throws are probably oak gall balls. Oak galls are used for making ink. See the Covenants book. Lions being afraid of donkeys is a new one on me. And the wolf must be of extraordinary size if it can swallow a woman dressed as a donkey whole. Regardless of that, statistics for dogs and lions and wolves are already available for Ars Magica. After the story is complete, there's a witch's tower in the forest which isn't being used by anyone and might be suitable for a small covenant. You'd probably want to make quite a secure ladder or build a spiral staircase around the tower. Your characters might be a small family of enchanters and enchantresses descended from the girl who was fed Viz in utero, but your saga may vary. Your characters might be a small family of enchanters and enchantresses descended from the girl who was fed Viz in utero, but your saga may vary.